fabulous thing about public architecture is that it's in the public domain, it's very useful, we all use it, we want to use it, it's a very democratic kind of form of architecture. But having said that, they're slow, they're bureaucratic, they're very difficult to get jobs. And then the more commercial private projects are often you're dealing with one client, so you can have a really amazing relationship with somebody. And I think one of the interesting things about architecture, you can think about architecture merely as the crystallisation of a series of conversations. And that's why buildings are such interesting artefacts. So if we look at a building that's 100 years old, we go, why is that interesting? Why it's interesting is that there were a series of conversations 100 years ago that were crystallised in that building. And we can use those blocks of stone, or whatever, bricks or whatever they're made out of, as a way of finding out what people were thinking then, because it's the resultant of that conversation, so we can kind of go backwards through that. And that becomes, that's why I think old buildings can be interesting. So when you do work with a client and you have these conversations, they end up as a building. We live in this period of time in history where there's a lot of management. Everything is kind of managed for whatever reason. And you see it a lot in buildings because buildings are very expensive things. And they have to last a long time. So there's this propensity for people to say, right, we have to write a brief and we have to define absolutely everything. And we have to say that's going to go there, that's going to be there, that's going to go there. Buildings change over time. Well, not so much buildings change, people's ideas change over time. So Carriageworks opened 6, 7 years ago. We were probably designing it 10 years ago, so let's say, and then it was probably thought about 5 years ago. So really that concept's been around for about 15 years. That's getting on a bit. And new people, new directors come, there's new direction, and slowly buildings, ideas change. So then you go, well, should we be designing buildings incredibly specifically, or should we be deliberately not designing them incredibly specifically so that they can evolve? And what we would argue is that we shouldn't design them incredibly specifically. We look at these briefs like that and we go, well, that might last 2 years. And then if it has no use after 2 years, what's.
Can I ask what you mean by specifically?
So for example, in the Carriageworks, there's lots of space between all of the performance areas. So there's rehearsal rooms on the, it's on the east side, which is the Everleigh train station side. There's 3 rehearsal rooms, and there's deliberately big spaces in between them. So now Treasury didn't want those spaces there because they were funding it. They said, oh, that's waste space. And that's what we said was, no, somebody will find a use for this space. And there's been lots of performances in those spaces. We provided a few services. There's lighting connections, there's power connections, and there's, we make sure that's well ventilated, there's enough air sort of thing for 100 people to sort of gather for an hour. So we would call that non-specific public space. So what we're saying is there's a piece of space here, and somebody who's creative will come and find a use for that space. It's a little bit like if you had a bedroom and you said, I'm going to put a wardrobe there, I'm going to build the bed into the wall here, I'm going to build a seat here.
Nothing is left for.
Yeah. So then when you come and to move into the bedroom, what you can do is totally determined by the architecture. You don't have a choice where you put your bed. That choice has been made for you. So we could say, okay, we could actually just make this beautiful room with some sun, we put the door and the window are a place that, and maybe the bed could be in 3 places. Maybe the wardrobe could be. So it's like that. It's how specific you want to make something. And so we like to advocate this idea for public architecture of loose, we call it loose fit public architecture, so that a number of things can happen in the future. And where it comes from, I think, is that we've done a lot of adaptive reuse architecture. We've adapted a lot of buildings, probably a quarter of our work is that. And what you find is when you come and adapt an old building, you realise that the first thing that's extinguished from a building or a piece of architecture is the use. So we write these briefs all around the use, but when you look at a building that's 50 or 100 years old, the use is no longer there, it's gone. And so then what is it, when you take the function out of the building, what's left? There's this kind of artefact, which is the kind of the idea behind it, the piece of architecture which reflects what people are interested in. Then, and I think that's how we've got to this position that public architecture doesn't need to be absolutely specific. The debate about building sustainability, nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about, well, if we could use this building usefully for 100 years, that's going to be way more sustainable than having some photovoltaic panels that are going to last for 10 years before they become inefficient to reduce the electricity rate.
But it's true, no one talks about this.
Because when you think of the amount of energy embodied in building a building and then taking it away and building another one, if you can make that one building last 100 years, that's for me, that's sustainability. But that's not in the kind of debate at the moment. Clearly have to work out how we reduce our material consumption on Earth for a whole range of reasons. But we would think of sustainability as sitting inside of the architectural concept, if you like. So it's not a kind of additive thing, it's actually just part of the architecture. So the first thing is, there's a couple of things. We will always look at what we've inherited. Like you get a site, and let's say it's a bigger site, and there's some existing buildings on the site. It's always much easier just to get rid of everything and start afresh. But there's a lot of embodied energy in those buildings, and you say, well, let's try and keep those. They may not be the most beautiful buildings. In fact, you may not even know that this new building has an old building inside of it. But so that's kind of step one, because those buildings represent embodied energy. Then the next thing is, I think this idea of thinking about the longevity of the building. How do you make it last? Not so much last, how do you make it useful for 100 years? And I think that one of the big strategies for that is this kind of idea of loose fit architecture, that you're not making things specific, down to where, in terms of building function. And then I think the other one, which is very difficult, is that we always like to look at materials that are, they're going to last a long time. When you talk about context, what you're talking about there is context. So what's the environment you're putting the building into? So it operates on a number of levels. There's a physical context. What's the size of the buildings physically next door? What's the street? What's the size of the street? Where's the sun? All of that sort of stuff. So then there's the the historical context. This becomes a matter of interpretation. We interpret the context. And this is something that's really interesting, because we each interpret a context differently. And we interpret it differently because we have different backgrounds, we have different upbringings, we have different interests. Or whatever, every person's different, so everybody brings something to it. And it's, I'll come back, there's a whole other side issue here, which I'll come back to. I'll ask you a question in a kind of simple way, and then I'll go off onto the side issue. So then you start to look at it, so you can think about a context physically and then culturally. And culturally I find really interesting, because it's like a sort of a fourth dimension. Because you're going back in time and you're asking the questions about if that building next door is the crystallisation of a series of conversations, what were those conversations? And what were they thinking about back then, whenever it was like 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Because they were thinking something different. Interpreting contexts is really interesting. And so when you build in areas of cities that are significant, like take the Rocks, for example, incredibly important part to Sydney on a whole number of levels. Firstly, because it was the location of the first white settlement in Australia, But secondly, in the 70s, the union movement effectively protected it. There was huge, it was going to be razed to the ground, and new buildings were going to be built, and through a whole series of community action, those buildings were protected and maintained. So it becomes a really important part of the city. So there's a series of controls put around that area to protect it.
It's all heritage in the city.
Yeah, so you read those controls, but what you realise is that those controls are written by a group of people. That's their interpretation of that area. Then, when you come to build in that area, the gatekeepers, if you like, the protectors of that area, are the heritage agencies. So there's the New South Wales Heritage Office, or Heritage New South Wales, as they're known now. And they have a board, and the board has a chairman, and they sit. So we proposed building this hotel I was talking about, based around the Harbour Bridge. And they tried to, well, the chair in particular tried to block that building or reject it because he didn't believe that it was appropriate. So, and then when you go back, okay, so I'm a kind of what you call a mid-generation architect. There's architects who are almost a generation older, who are still working, and then the ones who are almost a generation younger. So that older generation were part of the protection of that area. So their view is that any new building should be totally subservient and almost invisible to the historic fabric. And you can see why he's arguing that, because they fought so hard to protect it. They don't want to destroy it again. But what we would argue is that we actually have a role to represent our generation, to represent now, so that when the next generation comes to build in that area, those stories have been encapsulated in our buildings. So you get this kind of passing the baton through the history of time in the building up of a city. So, and that became, this was a very kind of tense ideological battle that we had, because whilst I understood his position, if you were to do that for 30 years, the rocks would end up being full of all these kind of dull buildings. Mm-hmm. So, subservient building, and it would start to, it would no longer have any vitality. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And one of the things that's really interesting about adaptive reuse buildings is if you inherit a building and you build a new building, you're effectively representing two moments of time on that site. So you're kind of transgressing time. These past and present are similarly present at the same time. So it's kind of